No? I need help with this. Please. At least I didn't say anything confidential. It would be a problem. Thank you all for being here. I'm Luby Levin, Associate Vice Chancellor for Campus Human Resources. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event. I'm looking forward to it. I wanted you to know that this special lecture series was started more than 8 years ago, and we have an event annually sponsored jointly by the Academic Senate, the UCLA Division of the Senate, the UCLA Staff Assembly, and my office. We're delighted to bring all of you together. It's one of the opportunities we have to reflect collaboration across faculty and staff lines, and also to share the philosophy of being a learning organization. Sometimes we lose sight of that, even though we have students here for their educational experience. Staff are equally interested in continuing to learn. And we are just excited to benefit from the outstanding faculty at UCLA who are willing to share their wisdom, their research results, their thought processes with us. So today is especially exciting. We have Professor Pedro Noguera. Okay. And his topic of racial inequality, education, and the future of American democracy cannot be more interesting, more important these days, the day before our election for a new president. So I'm going to be listening very carefully to what Professor Noguera tells us, and I know it will stimulate a lot of thought-provoking conversations and interest in our own views about this very important subject. I'm delighted and want to thank our Senate Chair this year, Professor Susan Cochran, for co-hosting this session. She'll do the introductions. And I also want to thank our Staff Assembly, current President Michelle Chen. Michelle, do you want to stand and wave? Okay. And special thanks to Rex Lorenzo for organizing this event. I know we really appreciate everything he's done. And I want to welcome you and have you join us after the presentation for some refreshments out here in the lobby behind the room. So with no further ado, let me ask Professor Cochran to come up and introduce our speaker.
Well, welcome to this presentation. I'm glad that you took time out of your busy day to come and learn something today. So this is good, because tomorrow we're going to learn other things tomorrow. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Pedro Noguera, a distinguished professor here in our Graduate School of Education and Information Sciences. He earned his bachelor's degree in sociology from Brown University and his doctorate from a campus to the north, which we won't talk about, but sometimes it's called Berkeley. Over the course of his career, he's been a classroom teacher, as well as a professor at Berkeley, Harvard, and NYU before joining us, probably to get out of the weather, I would think. And he is a scholar who does not hesitate to take his scholarship out of the ivory tower and translate it into policy recommendations, both by serving on various boards of governmental and non-governmental organizations, and by tweeting regularly on Twitter. His scholarship focuses on a simple but difficult to achieve ideal, which is that schools can achieve excellence in educating our youth only by creating an equitable environment in which students learn. He will be speaking to us today on racial inequality in education and the future of the American democracy. Please join me in welcoming Professor Noguera.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Staff Assembly for inviting me. Since this is only the beginning of my second year, I'm still learning my way around the campus and meeting lots of new people. This is my first time actually in the library. I feel embarrassed to say. So it's great to be here. I don't even know the fight song yet, but but I do notice there's so many similarities between our Berkeley song and yours. It's got me a little wondering about this, but it's good to be here and good to be at UCLA. I want to use my time today, when I get the clicker, to talk about an issue that's going to be with us for a long time, long after this election's over. And that's because the issues facing our country with respect to changing demographics and growing inequality have profound implications for what kind of country we're becoming. Living in Los Angeles, we're seeing it probably more clearly than many others across the country, but this is clearly more than just an LA issue. It is an American issue. And it has profound implications for what our future is going to be like, and education is going to play a role in this, either to help us figure out how to address some of these nagging problems or to make it worse. So I want to talk about that potential, and I'll do that without the clicker since it's not here. And I want to take us back. This is very sensitive because I didn't even touch it. And remind us that historically we've looked to schools to do things that were of great political and social significance. This is a classroom in Fresno. These are Sikh children around the turn of the century. And whether they were Sikh children or Italians in New York or the Irish of Boston, or you go down the line, we have historically looked to our schools to integrate immigrants into the country. And that's a very important role and continues to be one. Even now, the courts have ruled that even undocumented children have the right to an education in this country. So in many ways, our schools are far more accessible than any other institution. And although we don't provide them with guidance on how to integrate them, or even how to teach them English, or how to make sure that they are not part of a permanent underclass, we turn to schools to figure this stuff out. And the fact that they fail, I would say, is often not because of a lack of competence, but because of a lack of guidance and resources on how to do this very, very complex work. Similarly, we also look to schools to figure out how to end racial apartheid in this country. And this picture, I think, aptly reminds us that this was a violent confrontation. That is, the violence in the current mood should let it remind us again, this is not new. This, when a Republican president was forced to send the 82nd Airborne to Little Rock, Arkansas, to escort 9 black children to Central High School, it was just a reminder of how significant the racial barriers were, not just in education, but in all aspects of American society. What's important about this action, and the Supreme Court's ruling before that, is that the precedent we established in education really set the stage for ending racial barriers in all aspects of society. Right? That is, that's the reason why Brown is held up as being so important as a landmark decision, because once you say you can't do it in education, well then you can't do it in housing, or transportation, or voting, or all the other areas which, although we have laws now to allow it, really this action by the courts and by the federal government set the precedent for ending that system in this country. It's important to recognize that although it formally ended, our schools today are still segregated for the most part by race and class. LA has some of the most segregated schools in the country. And so although we don't have, thank you, legalized segregation anymore, which is not insignificant, we continue to have de facto segregation in our schools. Unfortunately, this doesn't work, so I will just keep on going with my finger. It's equally important, particularly because we're in Los Angeles. Remember, this was not just a black issue. Right? Although African Americans, I would say, got most of the attention. We have a case right here in Southern California, Garden Grove, that preceded the Brown decision, involving Latino children, Mexican American children particularly. And so the practices of discrimination were not unique to African Americans. They affected Native Americans, they affected Latinos, they affected the Irish at certain points in time, till the Irish became white, right? And that was a process too. Right? That is that the history of exclusion is very much tied to the history of education. And who we choose to educate is in many ways who we choose to include in the democracy. And so our schools have played a critical role in that process. Today, we're asking schools to do something they really aren't prepared for, namely to address poverty. And what we're seeing, and we've been seeing it for a long time, is the schools that serve the poorest children are almost always the schools that are failing. They fail, and this is very important to keep in mind, not because, again, of some inherent weakness, though there often are inherent weaknesses. They fail because they lack the resources to address issues that aren't educational, like hunger, like poor health, lack of eyeglasses, and going down the list, lack of stable homes, trauma. And we have a case now in Compton where trauma is being acknowledged as, or at least the courts are calling, or at least the lawsuit calls for it to be acknowledged as a form of disability. And we know that if it's recognized in Compton, guess what? It's not unique to Compton. This is, again, an issue throughout the United States. And so, over and over again, what we realize is that what we've done in this country is we've allowed our schools, our public schools that is, to become the social safety net for poor children. Because the public schools are the only institution that does not turn children away. And for many kids, it's the only institution where they'll be guaranteed a meal, maybe two, where they'll be guaranteed heat in the winter, or air conditioning, hopefully, in the summer, where we need it. Maybe even a nurse, if there is one, if we haven't cut it out the budget. And while that is inadequate, and usually it is, the fact is that our public schools are more stable, more accessible than any other institution in the country. No other institution steps up to do what our public schools do. And that's the reason why, even when I'm critical, and I'm often critical of what's going on in public education, I do so from a position of critical support because I recognize no other institution is willing to do what our public schools do right now. And the fact they fail is more reflection on our society than on the schools. We've had a discourse, and what's important about this, that is, it's run through both Republican and Democratic administrations about the fact that poverty is not an issue. Okay. It's ironic because we had No Child Left Behind, and that slogan came not from the Bush administration, but from the Children's Defense Fund. And when Marion Wright Edelman came up with the slogan, "Leave no child behind," it didn't mean to test the kids as frequently as possible. She really was talking about health and welfare and well-being. That's not part of No Child Behind. It's not part of ESSA, the new Every Student Succeeds Act. Right? And so we have this narrow vision of what matters in education. And usually what matters is how well kids do on tests. And so we have a quote that I think exemplifies that kind of narrow view. This one comes from Joe Klein, the former Chancellor of New York City, Janet Murguia of the National Council de la Raza, and Michael Lomax from the United Negro College Fund. And I'll read it. It says, in the debate over how to fix American public education, many believe that schools alone cannot overcome the impact that economic disadvantage has on a child. The life outcomes are fixed by poverty and family circumstances, and that education doesn't work until other problems are solved. This theory is, in some ways, comforting for educators. Now, that's a pretty cynical regard. Who would be comforted by that one, right? Problem is, the theory is wrong. It's hard to know how wrong, because we haven't yet tried to make the changes that would tell us. But plenty of evidence demonstrate that schools can make an enormous difference despite the challenges presented by poverty and family background. Now, what I'm going to show you in a little while is that there are indeed schools serving poor kids that do extremely well. And that, to me, is encouraging because it lets us know that when we do things right, when we address the needs of kids, and I don't just mean the social needs, but the academic needs as well, we can, in fact, use education as a means to change patterns of inequality. But for the most part, that's not what our policies do. Our policies ignore poverty. Our policies ignore the inequities. Our policies largely ignore the fact that we are one of the few countries in the world that deliberately spends more money on the affluent children than on the poor children. Most other advanced industrialized countries do not do that. Most other advanced industrialized countries provide universal preschool. Our preschools, 40% of our kids are not in preschool, first of all, and those that are hyper-segregated. Even in cities like New York that now have universal preschool, what the children of the poor get is nothing like what the affluent children get. And those disparities in learning opportunities reproduce the disparities in outcomes that we see in education that are so alive at a place like UCLA. This is a school in Philadelphia, Fair Hill School, that was over 100 years old. Over 100 years old. And what's happened in Philadelphia, where over 50 schools have been closed in the last 5 years, is being replicated in Detroit, being replicated in New Orleans, in New York, in several other cities across the country. That is, under the guise of school improvement and reform, what we've done is to just shut schools down. Now, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to note that that school is a quarter mile from Temple. That neighborhood is gentrifying very rapidly. Mm-hmm. One way to ensure that you can move poor people out is you get rid of schools that serve their children. Now that might sound conspiratorial, except I point to a school like DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. DeWitt Clinton High School once, not that long, in the 1970s, had over 6,000 kids, and it was integrated. Its graduates include people like James Baldwin, the novelist, right? And Burt Lancaster, the actor, and plenty of judges, and lots of generals and other dignitaries. Today, that school has just over 2,000 kids. It is the last choice school in the city. It has more homeless kids, more formerly incarcerated kids than any other school in the city. It's a school that people avoid if they can, because it offers nothing. It offers no lab science, none of the electives you would need to get to college. Arthur Levine, the former president of Teachers College, who graduated from that school, described that school and the CUNY system that he went to as an undergrad as a superhighway for working class Jews like him to the middle class. Why is that superhighway broken now? Why doesn't it exist anymore? Why is it that that school is in the shape it's in today? And again, that's not just a New York story, it's a story that's replicated over and over throughout the country. I did an event in December of last year at City Hall for LA's Best, which is an after-school program, featured civic leaders from across LA. And at one point I asked them how many of them had graduated from high school in LA. Nearly the entire room had people who graduated from public schools in LA. And then I asked, how many of you would put your own child in the school you graduated from today? Not a hand was up. Point I'm making is a point that many others have made, which is we once knew how to do this. We pretend like this has always existed. It hasn't always existed. 1964, when the Elementary Secondary Education Act was enacted by Lyndon Johnson as an executive order, right? It was thought of deliberately to compensate for poverty. And Johnson is an interesting figure in all this because he himself had been a teacher. He taught on the border. And he was up close recognizing that poor kids are struggling and you've got to do more. It never was going to equalize or level the playing field. It simply was to compensate for some of the disadvantages. And that's the way it was thought of. Today, as poverty rates have risen since the recession of 2008, what we're seeing is places like San Bernardino, which has some of the highest poverty rates in the country, their schools totally overwhelmed. Not just by poverty, but by gangs, by violence, by all the other issues that we associate with poverty, because poverty is more than an economic issue. And all the rankings tell us that where poverty is concentrated in this country, school failure is the norm. And all the threats and all the pressure in the world is not changing that. But that's exactly what state and federal policies largely consisted of: threats and pressure. Compton schools were under state control for almost 8 years. Every single urban school in New Jersey is under state control, with the exception of Elizabeth. But we have an accountability system that holds those with the most power the least accountable. No power on the governor, no accountability on the governor. You haven't heard Chris Christie say, my schools aren't doing well. No accountability on the state legislature. All the accountability downward on teachers, maybe principals, and of course the children. And so we have ample evidence that when poverty rates rise, school failure rises too. We have lots of evidence that right now, if you saw the article in the New York Times last week, The highest cause of death now of children between the ages of 10 and 14 is no longer car accidents, it's suicide. Suicide. We have lots of evidence that on many, many different indicators, our kids are in trouble. But we don't have policies that are designed to address it. And instead what we do is we blame schools. And so, yep, the poverty rates have risen. But what's important to keep in mind is that as inequality rises, that so-called American dream becomes more and more distant possibility. I think that's one of the issues that's driving this election, in fact, is the fact that so many Americans feel completely shut out of any possibility of improving their lives. Here's a quote from Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize-winning economist. He says, "The United States has become the most unequal country amongst advanced industrial countries. We have less opportunity than not only all of Europe, but any of the advanced industrial countries for which there's data. And what that means is very simple. The life chances of an individual are more dependent on the income and education of their parents than in other countries. And an implication of that is people born in the bottom, who unfortunately chose the parents who were poor and not well educated," he's joking, "will be more likely not to be able to live up to their potential. Right now, a poor student with high grades has less chance of graduating from college than a mediocre wealthy student." That's been true for a while. And so the idea that we are a country where inequality, or where hard work pays off, is an idea that is increasingly a myth. LA, again, captures this, probably better than any other city. Here's a quote from, forgive me, a USC professor, Ed Kleinbard, who says, "We are the richest economy in the world, but an extraordinary number of Americans live in poverty. We are the most unequal society amongst all peer economies, and even more shocking, we are nowhere near the top in income mobility." California would be the 7th largest nation in terms of per capita GNP, gross national product, our economy. But we are 43rd in per pupil spending. Even now, I want to give the state and the governor credit for investing in equity-based funding formula. It's very important. It's brought extra resources, but we're starting from so far behind in California. Class sizes of 33 in our high schools. This is not a setup for changing our future. And what's important to keep in mind is the racial dimension of this. It's important because the demographics are changing, as we'll see when we see the polling results. Demographers predict by 2043, those who have been in the minority will be the majority. Which means that we will become an apartheid-like nation, because those in the majority are stuck on the bottom. Stuck on the bottom on almost every indicator that matters. Recent studies on homelessness, and LA has larger homeless population than any state in the country. That too shows those same racial fissures. Though it's more than that, because our homeless are also increasingly the mentally ill and others who have been denied services and opportunities. Robert Putnam, a political scientist at Harvard, wrote a book a couple years ago called Our Kids. He goes back to the town he grew up in Clinton, Ohio. A town that in 1964, when he graduated, sent 80% of its kids to college. He goes back in 2014, and what does he find? Devastation. Same town, now with high dropout rates, schools that don't function, big mansions along Lake Erie still doing fine, but their kids don't go to the public schools, they go to private schools. And he asked what happened. Again, this is not unique to Clinton, Ohio or Los Angeles. It's happening throughout America today. And the more it happens, the more distant the possibility of using education to drive opportunity becomes. And we've seen it here at UCLA. We've seen increasingly, not only has the university gotten less diverse, racially, which is what we pay so much attention to, but socioeconomically. Who can afford to come here? Who has access at a public university? This is just a question of who has access to advanced placement courses in Los Angeles. LA County spends $233,000 per juvenile that it incarcerates, $233,000. for a system widely regarded as one of the worst in the country. We're spending under $11,000 per pupil in the public schools. Investing in the wrong things. There is a PTA not far from here that raises over $1 million a year though, and that's a public school. So we have to be careful when we think about these because the inequities show up even within the same system. These are dropout rates. Just came out from a report from the U.S. Department of Education. Shows Latinos, the fastest growing population, has some of the highest dropout rates. And while we're celebrating, and we should, the rising high school graduation rates, including in LA Unified, we should be very concerned that 2/3 of them have to take remedial courses in college. Because most of those kids will not get out. So, as I said already, the achievement gap has to be seen and recognized for what it is. It is an educational manifestation of inequality. That's what it is. And all the focus on test preparation, all the focus on reform, if it does not address things like access to preschool, right, and equality preschool, does not address the inequities in funding among schools, and the huge gaps in opportunities. Right now, there is a gap of about 6,000 hours in learning time between middle-class kids and poor kids, when you include after school, summer school. Because affluent families invest, are able to invest more in their children. Money matters. Always does. The only ones who say money doesn't matter are people with lots of money. Meredith Phillips, a colleague here in public policy, says that here, if you just look at preschools, museums, this is before age 4, there's a 1,300-hour gap. 1,300-hour gap in learning time. If we don't address these gaps, we are going to find that our schools not only continue to reproduce inequities, but we have a permanent underclass created, not just by our schools, but created by these deep structural divisions. So the question I've been focused on, the question I've been asking through my own work, is how do schools mitigate the effects of poverty and exert a positive impact on the communities and children they serve? Is that possible? And if so, what does it look like when we do it? And secondly, what kind of education, is important, I'll come back to that in a moment, is needed for schools to play a role in expanding opportunity and breaking the cycle of poverty? That's not the questions we typically ask. We're focused, how do we raise achievement? Again, it's measured by test scores. It's the wrong question. Well, we have some models that are showing us there are ways to mitigate the effects of poverty. You can bring social workers into schools, psychologists, you can bring nurses, you can build partnerships so that teachers don't have to become or act like they are social workers and psychologists. And the best model for doing this is the Harlem Children's Zone, led by Jeffrey Canada. Jeffrey Canada's target is 6,000 kids in Central Harlem, and they provide wraparound services from birth right through college now. And it includes parent education, it includes a whole number of social supports for families and children. It was the model that President Obama used to start the Promised Neighborhood Initiative. We have a Promised Neighborhood Zone here in LA. But unlike his initiative, which is funded by Goldman Sachs and hedge funds, he's raised over $175 million to do this work. Most of the other initiatives have very little money at all, because Congress didn't fund it. So we have an example of places where we're doing it, where we're actually having a back. Not to say that we're leveling the playing field through this, but we are in fact seeing the results in terms of greater numbers of kids going off to college and graduating. Children's Aid Society in New York City has been doing it longer than anybody in the country, but their model is extremely expensive and hard to replicate. And so many people look at it and say, well, we can't afford it. And so a lot of the other models we're seeing like this are really a shadow of what we know is required to give schools a chance to address issues related to poverty. Because poverty is not simply an economic issue. Mm-hmm. It's a psychological issue, it's an emotional issue, it's a health issue. We also have schools like the East Bay Biotech. I was just explaining this. This is a consortium of schools now in the East Bay, over 25 years old. It's a partnership between 7 high schools, 5 biotech companies, 2 community colleges, 1 four-year school. Kids are able to get training in biotech and graduate from high school into jobs paying $18 an hour. That's important. It's important because a lot of our students who go to college are still working their way through college. 1 out of 10 students in the CSU system right now are homeless. 1 out of 10. And most of them don't have skills to get jobs like these. The old voc ed that many of us remember from our days when they were shopped for some kids we thought were not college material, that's not this. These kids are taking 4 years of science, 4 years of math. If they decide they don't want to do biotech, they still have all the credits and courses they need to go off to college and do something else. This doesn't narrow options, it expands options. And we have lots of other examples like this. A renewable energy project in Newark, a small business incubator project that I think is excellent in Providence, Rhode Island, the urban health program in the Bronx where kids can graduate with EMT certification at the end of high school. Year Up, I'm on the board of, which is working with 12 cities, now it's 16, serves over 12,000 youth, gets them the jobs paying $40,000 to $50,000 a year after 6 months of training. Many of these are kids with GEDs. So there's a lot more we could do if the focus and the priorities were right. There's a lot more we could do if we got schools to stop focusing on achievement and got them to focus instead on getting kids excited about learning, getting them engaged. There are 36 schools in New York City that have waivers from the state to do performance-based assessment. That is, they actually look at the work kids produce rather than their test scores to see whether or not they've learned. And what they're finding is that the kids who graduate from those schools more likely to go to college and more likely to stay in, less likely to be in remedial courses. What's different about these schools is that they actually spend time thinking about how to get kids engaged, how to make learning matter, how to get kids motivated, how to use science, we were talking about science a little while, as a way to get kids tapping into the natural curiosity kids have. And when we see that happen, like with this school here in East LA, Hollenbeck Middle School, this is a 90-minute math class. And kids are up out of their seats, doing math. And the teacher's so good she can stand in the back and talk to me. Because she doesn't have to hover. Which means the kids are not just learning math, they're also learning how to work together, how to listen, how to problem solve. All the things the Common Core calls for, they're learning it in this math class. This is the highest form of academic engagement, and therefore the highest form of classroom management. Because the kids are managing themselves. And because the kids are on task, the teacher can move amongst them and see who needs help. These are all poor kids, many of them English language learners, many of them undocumented. They come from East LA. Now the sad thing is that while that was happening in that class right next door, there was the cemetery method. You know the cemetery method? Line them up in rows, keep them as still as possible. That's still the dominant mode of teaching. And too many of our schools, teachers who can teach like that, no one's learning from. And they're working in isolation. Youth Speaks is an organization developed at UC Davis. The idea, they said, well, you know, kids like rap, maybe we could use rap to teach literacy. Maybe we can use literacy as a way to get kids writing and about their experiences. And now what we're finding is the literacy circles they're creating can also help deal with trauma. I sat in on a literacy circle at Grant High School. Grant High School is in a part of Sacramento called Del Paso Heights, DPH. The kids call DPH the deeper part of hell. That's what they call it, because of the problems that are there. And I sat in a circle, literacy circle, led by, who was a person, not a teacher, she was called a poet mentor, who gave the students a prompt, and then told them to write. The prompt was, I'm not who you think I am. And then she modeled it for them. She said, you might think you see a professional woman in front of you, but I'm actually a person who is one paycheck away from being homeless. And I'm responsible for my mother, and I've got a brother in prison. There's so much more about me than meets the eye. And I bet you that's true for you. And then she asked the kids to write about their stories. And the kids sat down, writing. These are kids who typically don't write a whole lot in school. At the end of 20 minutes, she said, who's ready to share? They all shot up their hands and proceeded to share their stories. And the first girl to speak up said, I am not cancer. She had just been diagnosed 2 weeks ago. And over again, kids sharing their stories, being embraced by others with support, exactly what the research literature shows should be done in schools where kids experience high levels of trauma. Building community, acknowledging the humanity of the kids, and at the same time developing their academic skills. Wow, all in one. All in one. I was meeting with the principal of the school, who was from Grant himself, had been a student there, dedicated, committed, and all he could tell me about is we're in trouble because our scores are low, we're in trouble because the district wants us to raise the score. We go to that class, I said, do more of that. That's your solution right there. But a lot of times we're not looking right where we should to get the help we need. Here's a school in the Eastern Cape of South Africa that I visited in the townships outside of Port Elizabeth. The principal, who's in the back with the camera, was assigned to this school. It was in shambles. It had broken windows, all the pipes taken out. People sold the pipes. No water could get to the building. Kids weren't showing up, teachers weren't showing up. He's sent there to be the new principal. He's like, what am I going to do? So he decides he's going to start by holding a party. He calls it a Thanksgiving party. He's going to thank the community for their support. He offers food and music, and people come. So they laugh and say, why are you thanking us? He said, I'm thanking you in advance. The support you're going to have to give me. And he proceeds to talking to the parents and to the community about what's wrong with this school. And they said, well, the problem here is, we have a lot of very poor people. A lot of our kids are orphans. 40% of the kids that attend the school are orphans, lost their parents to AIDS. He says, we got to draw on the community to support the school. First thing he does, he puts a stop to the vandalism by getting guys who were vandalizing to be security at the school in exchange for housing. Can't pay them, but now they have free housing, so they're there 24 hours. He gets mothers at the school to take the land, cultivate the land. They have a thriving garden now on the site. Produce enough food not only for the school, but for many of the families in the area too. There's a clinic staffed by parents, not trained. I said, what happens if a kid is really sick? They said, well, usually we just give them a glass of water and rub their head. It works half the time. If it doesn't, we've got to call in a real nurse. Over 80 parents a day volunteer at the school. And they do everything from fix chairs to help teachers to grow food in the garden. I kept asking parents like these, who are the leadership council of the school, why do you volunteer? What gets you to do it? They said, well, I wasn't doing anything anyway. And now I'm a part of helping this school to be a much better place. And now it's a thriving school with not another dime from the Ministry of Education. I point to this example because we have resources that never get tapped in this country, human resources. And when you see a place like this, Sapphire Rose, and you see the energy they've created and the support they've created without any assistance from the government, you realize we have so much more power and potential than we think we have. They were organizing a march when I was there against the Ministry of Education because teachers haven't been paid for several weeks. And he was going to march with them. And I said, in the United States, principals don't usually march with parents. He said, listen, if I don't march with them, they'll be coming after me. So I got to be with them. So think about that. He understands he's got to be accountable to the community he serves. Different way of thinking about schools and how they're positioned in our communities. So I've been one of several people across the country been saying we need a different policy approach. We say a more holistic, integrated approach that links education and community development, that brings early childhood education and extended learning opportunities to kids, that coordinates health services so that schools have the resources they need, and a shift in the focus of policy away from standards and accountability, what my friend Michael Fullen calls the wrong drivers of change, and onto capacity building. Capacity building is the strategy that's used in the highest performing urban city in North America, I have to qualify that, highest performing city in North America is Toronto. When a school's in trouble, the ministry goes and says, how can we help? What do you need? Based on your data, it looks like you need some help in math. We're going to help you. We're not going to threaten you. We're not going to fire your teachers. We're going to actually help you to get better. Capacity building looks a lot different than what we get in most states. So there is a competition, and it's going to be interesting after this election which way we go. The narrow approach that I've described has been the dominant approach, and it's taken us where we are. That's why we're seeing pressure and a narrow focus on achievement, test scores used to rank schools, rank kids, skip scripted curriculum to make the curriculum teacher-proof, and drive out your best teachers, because no teacher who with any brains wants to just follow a script. Treating parents as consumers, and using discipline to drive out the bad kids. The broad approach says, no, we got to focus on the conditions for teaching and learning in schools. We got to focus on using assessment to diagnose learning needs, not merely to rank kids. We've got to develop the skills of teachers continuously, because the skills of the teachers have to match the needs of the kids. If that doesn't happen, nothing you do will change the outcomes for kids. Broad approach says we've got to focus on the whole child. Safety, health, nutrition. Got to hold everyone accountable. Kids, parents, teachers, principals, governors, state legislature. Got to treat parents as partners, use discipline to develop character, expand learning opportunities, and promote cooperation among schools, that we're learning from each other, learning from what works instead of working in isolation. Now, part of this exists. Little elements of this exist. Every once in a while, I find a school where I see many of the features of that broad approach in place. School right here in San Fernando Valley. Social Justice Humanitas, an LA Unified pilot school, ranks #1 amongst high schools on all the indicators related to trust and teacher expectations. I was visiting the school 2 weeks ago, and I asked the kids in a large classroom, I said, how often at the end of the day do you go home and tell your parents, I was inspired by what I learned today? Usually when I ask that question, people laugh. I said, not too often. You know what the kids told me at that school? I said, every day. I said, every day? I'm shocked to hear that. I said, give me an example. What did you tell your father? What did you tell your parents yesterday? One kid said, I told my father about forced sterilization of women in the 1930s yesterday. That was going on. Another kid said, they're doing the 5 languages of love amongst students to work on relationships amongst kids and teachers. And they said, I did that with my mom when I got home. I asked the teachers, what's the best thing about working here? They said, the kids. I said, what's the hardest thing about working here? They said, the feedback we get from the kids. Because kids actually tell us what they think about our teaching. One girl said she had a teacher who didn't talk to her for 2 years because she had hurt feelings. She told her she was disorganized. So now I got over it, I'm better. Capacity building is a more integrated way of thinking about schools. It requires us to think holistically about the needs of kids, about the needs of the communities. It makes a difference. And we're seeing it in places like Brockton, Massachusetts. Brockton High School is the largest high school in the state with over 4,200 kids. One of 2 urban high schools in the state that gets a level 1 rating. All the other level 1 rated schools are in affluent suburbs. You know what the secret is at Brockton? Literacy. Every teacher is a teacher of literacy, whether they teach math or phys ed or art. Kids are reading and writing across the curriculum. They started that in 1998. They've been doing it ever since. Since 2010, over 90% of the kids at Brockton passed the state exam. Massachusetts exam is more rigorous than any exam in the country. Over 1/3 gets the highest possible score. That gets them a free scholarship at any public university. Now, while Brockton was doing that, Boston, Springfield, all the other urban centers, Lawrence Lynn, were doing test prep. And they're still doing test prep. Because we don't learn from examples like these. or these. PS 28 in Brooklyn. We have very fancy names for our schools in New York. School where 30% of the kids are homeless, but a school that has built partnerships with a YMCA, with a local hospital, with a community development organization, because she's thinking about all the needs of the kids. And because she is, the teacher can focus on teaching and learning. So when you look at schools like these, you realize not only can we do it, we better do it. Because we have too much at stake not to. Country is changing. I would say the people who should be most worried about the current state of affairs are old white people. Because most of our baby boomers are old white people whose retirement is dependent upon young kids of color getting jobs. Because that's how the system works, doesn't it? These employees have to work to support the retirees. And if they can't, guess what? The whole thing falls apart. So we are interdependent. We are in this together. And despite all the polarization we're seeing right now, we better be glad immigrants still want to come. Because they're still doing all the hard work. And if this country lost immigrants, if this became a place where immigrants didn't want to come, we would be in serious trouble right now. We'd have no food to eat. Right? Hotels wouldn't work. The whole construction industry would fall apart. So we need to change the whole narrative about what it means to really reform schools and move away from what we've been doing, which has gotten us to where we are. And to start realizing that, you know, I was saying this before we started, you know, here we love football more than we love kids in America. You know, and that might sound trite, but I have plenty of evidence that it's true. You know, think about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. A year after Katrina, the Saints were in the Super Bowl. The Superdome, which had housed hundreds of people from the Katrina, was spanking new again. 10 years later, there was only one school in the lower 9th Ward. One school. Our priorities have taken us to where we are. So I'm glad to see the staff interested. You should be, because our future depends on it. Thank you. Take some
And
questions.
open up for Q&A. Any questions?
Yes.
So I appreciate that you have these great examples of projects that work across the country. The first one that you pointed out there, though, was a single man who went in and made changes. I realized that.
You about Jeff Canada?
Yes.
Oh, no, but he has a lot of people with.
Well, but I'm sorry. It's one institution.
Right.
And he
Right.
himself went in and did
Right.
it. So while what we need is a societal shift
That's
to make
right.
serious changes, can you point to any, like, let's acknowledge that we need baby steps. What are policy things that you're pushing that a state legislature should consider now to promote these kinds of things so that it's not one person with the ability to raise a ton of money
Right.
making a limited difference in
Sure.
the grand scheme of things?
So there are lots of baby steps. I'll give you an example. San Francisco and Alameda County have, several years now, passed a county-wide resolution requiring, I believe it's 5% of the general fund to go to youth services. 5%, which doesn't seem like a lot. It's more than tripled the amount of money available for kids. So there's after-school programs, so it's their county-funded after-school programs, summer programs, etc. We should be doing that on the state level. Right? We have programs like MESA, which we've known for years work. Why is it still so small? Upward Bound, we used to run an Upward Bound program at the center I directed at NYU, served kids with special needs. We were sending over 90% of them to college every year. It's cost effective to invest in programs like that. Now, I know that, you know, I don't want to pretend that it's simple. Okay, I was meeting with the superintendent of the LA County, right? Lovely person, Deborah Duarte, who was herself a dropout from school. Right? She has a passion to want to do something. She's in charge of these juvenile correction centers. I said, let's work together, try to make them humane. Right? So we're not wasting so much money. You know what I mean? Less than, over 2/3 of the kids right now in corrections will be back in less than 2 years. That's what we're doing. So I think it requires action on multiple levels, federal, state, local, that we've got to rethink how we're approaching this to begin to make some incremental change. I'm now very much an incrementalist. I don't think we're going to change anything real quick. But I think, and part of the reason why I cite examples like these is to say, look, we don't have to wait until we get the right person elected. We can do a lot right now, right here, with the right combination of people working together. You got the mic.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to kind of implementing, however incremental these changes are, and especially financial investment shifts, in the face of, I think what many people would call the prison industrial complex, and especially in LA County, and the role of probation as controlling youth development and youth development services, which I think is different from most of the rest of California and a lot of the rest of the country.
So, I mean, that's the reason why I brought up the juvenile corrections, is because that's where the money is. You know, and it's a totally failed system. I mean, when I left California in 2000, prison guards were making twice as much as teachers for a starting salary. That tells you a lot about priorities. Right? So we've got to, you know, I was on a panel with the governor of Colorado just a few months ago, and I said, that's where the money is. You got to figure out ways to change that. You got to, if we just got rid of the nonviolent drug offenders, that would have a huge, lead to a huge reduction in the number. Then we can figure out the more complicated cases, right? But we've got to first of all recognize that that path we've been on, which took this state from #1 in higher ed. I mean, I don't know where we stand now. Right? I don't want to say we're not #1. People get all set up. Right? But we are spending more money now on prisons than we do on higher ed. Right? And that wasn't the case when I first came. And so it needs, you know, I think I want to give the governor credit, Brown, who was governor when I first came, and he's back again, right? I think he's moved us in the right direction, but we got so many more steps to take. And I hope whoever comes next will continue to do the hard work. Because, you know what, we should recognize, California's not poor. California's cheap, you know? You can't be home to Silicon Valley and Hollywood and agribusiness and then say we have no money. So the question is where the money is. And how do we get it where it's needed? Here and then there. Is there any water around Ramses? Is it possible to get some? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I have a question about what you were talking about with trying to engage students to become more curious and I guess engage them in their learning in that way. So that example that you showed of that middle school where they were learning math standing up, I wondered if, I see the cemetery approach, it's
A lot.
used, and even,
You know why? They model from us. We teach it here.
I was going to say, it's not just in, you know, middle, high school, elementary, we use it in college, and, you know, I was wondering if for that particular classroom, if she had a moment where she used that to give them the building blocks they needed to
Sure.
have this interactive discussion.
Well, that's a very good question. So she didn't start the year like that. You can't start the year like that because the kids aren't ready for it, right? That's not the way they've been taught. She has to start the year with direct instruction. She has to establish the norms. She has to get to know them. Because think about all the things she knows. See, the problem is someone looks at a classroom like this and they don't recognize or understand everything that goes into it. She can't start like that on the first day of school. Because what she knows is that boy can't sit next to that girl because he has a crush on her. He won't get any work done, right? So we're going to separate them, right? So there's so much she knows is going on in that room, right? To pull this off. Somebody looks at this and say, oh, that's easy. No, a lot of teachers look at that and say, that's hard. Chaos is around the corner. This is middle school. All you need is a fart in there and it's all over, right? But she's not worried about that because she's prepared them for it,
Okay.
right? And so a lot of planning goes into that. That is not for novices, right? Not for novices. But teachers need to be able to see this to know that kids can do it. Because a lot of people think those kids can't do that because they've never seen kids like that learning in this way. Yes.
Thank you. I wanted to know your thoughts on how do you feel about the emergence of charter schools in the mix, and are they helping or harming our system?
So I'm an avid tweeter and Facebooker now. I just posted an article. David Leinhardt, I can't get his name right, but he writes for the New York Times. He wrote an article about a charter school I know in Boston, the Mac School. And he talks about the excellence in results. See, what we know is not all charter schools are good. And we also know that in some of them there's real corruption going on because there's no transparency in how money's being used and there's a lack of accountability. At the same time, there are some that are doing really good. And part of why they're doing good is because they get to pick the teachers. Part of why they're doing well is because they have a more clear focus. Now, some of them don't serve the neediest kids, so there's a lot going on there. But rather than simply dismiss it, I would say let's learn from it. Let's incorporate some of the lessons into the public schools. Let's move away from competition over kids, which is what's happening in LA, right? The public schools are losing, to more collaborative approach so that we are learning from what works. So that would also require a policy shift in the state legislature so that we facilitated that kind of learning and collaboration. That's not happening now. This row does so all the time.
So my question is about the ethno-racial mismatch among the teacher population and student population in our public schools. So I guess my question really is, in this post-racial era, does race matter when it comes to having teachers that have a cultural competence and or similar background as the student body in which they're educating? And is that something that goes into this whole, what makes this holistic model work? Because as you were showing certain examples, one thing that I took note of is that these leaders in these educational institutions seem to be similarly situated from an ethno-racial standpoint as the communities that they're serving.
So we now have more and more evidence that it absolutely does matter. Right? Just a study by a former colleague at NYU just showed teachers of color, particularly black teachers, less likely to refer black kids to special ed, less likely to suspend them, more likely to refer them to gifted classes. Right? So we have lots of evidence it matters in ways that are pretty profound. At the same time, this is where it gets complicated again, there's no guarantee. Right? That's because you have the same ethnic match that suddenly things are going to get better. Right? You still have to be a good teacher. Right? There's all those other things that have to be in there too. But it's not so it's to say, yes, it matters, but we need to make sure that people still get the resources, the training, support they need. But it's an issue that, again, we haven't paid attention to as we've seen the number of teachers of color, particularly African American teachers, decline in our schools. And that's happening across the country. So, huge issue. Huge challenge for a place like UCLA because although I think we have an excellent teacher education program at Center X, it's very expensive to become a teacher here. And if we don't find a way to make it accessible, we should make teaching a very, very attractive profession. Right?
Absolutely.
We should give them sabbatical after a certain number of years, right? We should, I've been telling LA Unified, why not subsidize housing for teachers? How can teachers even live in LA, right? On a teacher salary, right? We need to do things to make it a job that people who might otherwise study engineering would say, no, I'm going to teach. And actually know math too. I saw here, and then we'll work back. Sybil next.
Kind of piggybacking on the previous question is, I noticed on your Facebook posting you had put earlier this month regarding that you don't traditionally support having a diversity type of staff person within a school district because as very true to what you said, that they're typically just window dressing, which is why we're 30, 40 years in, and we've had diversity, people in all types of positions, and we've moved, not even an increment in many cases. So along the same line, how would you see that happening, let's say here, even in LAUSD, where we have such a diverse population, economically, racially, culturally, just across the board, and then how would we use, or could we use those staff folk to then help our teachers who have been embedded in these systems for 15, 20 plus years?
So these are hard questions to give me. So this is where I push with my grad students a lot, right? I got at least one of them here today. You know, because they want to say, you know, we got to put race at the center. I said, okay, let's put it at the center. Now what do you do with it when it's at the center? What do we do with it, okay? I'll give you an example. I'm at a school, it's a high school in LA, right? And we're doing a review of the school, and we see, now this is a school, most of the kids are Latino, but there's a small, maybe 10, 15% of the kids are black. Black kids are in the hallway. Black kids are in class not doing their work, and teachers are not saying anything to them. And the principal, who's black, is acting like he doesn't see it either. And I'm looking at him like, you don't see those kids doing Snapchat in class? Because I do. And no one is even telling them, put it away. I mean, so race is central, but what do we do with that? It's much more complex, I think, sometimes than we recognize. Now, I would say what we've got to do is actually talk to those kids about why they're in school in the first place. What are their dreams? What are their aspirations? Figure out some way to get them re-engaged, because they right now are so alienated from learning that they just show up in body, they're not there in mind. And the school has done nothing to engage them. So we got to re-engage the kids. But to me, that's what we name who's not engaged, right? But then the strategy is not necessarily going to be racial, right? The strategy is going to be, it might be computer science. We were just talking about that. It might be poetry, it might be art, it might be something else, because our kids are more than their box. They're more than the racial category they're in, right? And I think that's where racial thinking sometimes trips us up.
Yeah.
We think we need a racial remedy to a racial problem. We may not need a racial remedy. Right? The problem of the achievement gap may not lie in just targeting certain kids. The problem might lie in improving teaching, creating better schools. That's where I think it lies. And so I just think we have to be really careful. I often tell people who have those jobs, the chief diversity officer or the chief equity officer, say, well, who reports to you? I said, my secretary. I said, well, then you have no power. So you can't do anything. So it's a waste of time. And they get worried, they say, well, I might get fired. Now you tell everybody I have a wasted job, right? But why pretend that we're doing something when we're really not doing anything? I work with a district outside of Denver. They had a chief equity officer who resigned, and then the superintendent stepped up and said, I'm going to be the chief equity officer from now on. Because if it sits with me, it's going to happen. Because it wasn't happening before. That's when we see a real change. When these issues become to the center of what we're doing, not a marginal issue. Make sense? So.
You mentioned sabbaticals and subsidized housing. What else would you do to make the teaching profession desirable again?
Well, that's a good starting point. You know, I think that teachers, first of all, once you've taught, and I know you've taught, it's emotionally draining, right? It's exhausting. One of my students is doing a study on, hard-working teacher who is like totally stressed. He can't even pee regularly. Okay? Seriously. Okay, that's a problem, right? And he's working is not about lazy. It's about overwhelming. Let's first of all, let's make it less overwhelming. Let's reduce, maybe instead of teaching 5, 6 sections a day, let's make it down to 4. So you're seeing fewer kids. Because if you see fewer kids, maybe you can give them quality feedback now. Because if you had to grade 150 papers, how many times are you going to assign a paper? I know, for me, I'm struggling with 15. Right? Okay? So there's so many things about the conditions of work that we need to think differently about. There are a few schools, private schools, charter schools that have been thinking about that. How to make teaching a sustainable profession. Right? So that people will not, because think about it, teaching's the kind of profession you actually, well, if you are getting the right support, you can get better at it over time. We're losing so many teachers in the first 5 years before they even get good. It makes no sense. It's not cost effective and has a huge impact on kids. So,
Pedro, could you just go to what are the implications for how we think about union contracts? I'm a big believer in the historical value of unions.
Sure.
I completely see the protection and the needs, and yet I also see some need for shifts and considerations around conditions and creation of a school culture. What's your latest thinking on that?
I think you've got to negotiate around the issues that matter. So for example, it should not be that it's so hard to remove a person who is just clearly not good, right, at teaching. And we have rules, tenure rules, that make it extremely difficult. That's something to negotiate for. Say, if we have more money to give you, in exchange for that little bump up, we want to make it expedited review so we can get somebody out much quicker than we do right now. Because you actually undermine other teachers when you allow people who clearly are not good and don't even like kids to stay in schools as long as we do. So that is one example, but there are many more. But we've got to make sure that at the same time as we are taking away what people saw as privileges of the job, we're also building up the job to make it more attractive at the same time. That's the reason why I was against getting rid of tenure. If you just get rid of tenure, one of the few things that a teacher has, now you're taking it away. Now that's really attractive now, right? Now you have job security for a lousy job, right? Yes.
So I'm thinking about school partnerships with cultural institutions, and I'm wondering what role you see museums and libraries playing in closing the achievement gap.
I think there's a lot of potential. Again, I think that we have institutions, cultural institutions, hospitals, universities that have resources that should be helping schools. For a very short while, that was part of the strategy in New York. Right? They built partnerships. Some of them lasted. So there's a very strong partnership between the Museum of Natural History in New York City and a small number of schools. And it's great. Because so teachers are sitting with people at the museum to think about how do we use the museum as a part of your curriculum. So kids can actually see the history that they're learning about in the classroom. But I'd say we just barely scratched the surface on doing that. There's so much more. Think about LA has so many cultural resources that are not readily available. Think about how many kids never leave their neighborhood, never have access to the Getty Museum or any of the other amazing places we have. So we've got to be, I think, much more creative. If I could talk to the mayor, Garcetti, I would say that should be your priority. Don't try to take over the schools like the last guy. That's not a good strategy, because especially when you know what to do with them anyway, right? Think about, okay, how do we build support systems for schools? Right? So that schools get help they need on an ongoing basis. And I think that would be a smarter strategy than focusing on getting the Olympics to come to LA.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you. Chen, I'm the president of Staff Assembly, and I want to thank Professor Noguera for taking time out of his really busy schedule to share his fascinating research with us today. And Staff Assembly is very grateful for your time, so we want to present to you a small token of our appreciation.
All right. Thank you. Look, I got my UCLA hat. And even another clap. Thank you.
So this is our 8th year co-hosting this event, and it wouldn't be possible without our partners, the Academic Senate and Campus Human Resources. So I want to thank Associate Vice Chancellor Luby Levin and Chair Susan Cochran for their support. And I also want to thank our Staff Assembly Vice President of Special Projects, Rex Lorenzo, for all his hard work in putting this event together. And so this now concludes our event. Please feel free to stick around for some refreshments just outside the glass doors. Thank you for coming.